Yesterday's lecture dealt with the Grant administration and how it left three major legacies on American history. First, we discussed how President Grant was elected on a wave of popularity, Union success, waving the bloody shirt and reminding the nation and Democrats that the Republican Party and the Union had persevered in the Civil War. Next, we looked at how corruption and patronage, those types of activities, affected the political landscape during this time. And in order to support that theory, we were looking at specific examples of corruption. We talked about Jay Gould and his efforts to monopolize the American gold industry. We looked at the Tweed political ring in New York City and how New York and other cities were run by political machines that would issue patronage to people that supported them financially, or groups of individuals that voted for a political boss would receive important political jobs like fire department or law enforcement positions. The last remaining element of corruption that we have to discuss here before we move on to the third legacy of the Grant administration is the credit mobilier scandal. As we've discussed before, the railroad played a very important part of the growing American economy. President Lincoln had created the Transcontinental Railroad using private companies, the Union and Pacific Railroad companies, publicly funding those companies so that they could establish a route between Omaha and San Francisco. The Union and Pacific Railroad companies would eventually merge into one company, and it would continue to receive public funds. When a private company receives public funds, it's still important that they use those funds in a way that is respectful to the public interest and uses the public wealth in a responsible kind of way. Usually before a publicly funded business can spend any money, they have to take bids from competing agencies. So in this particular case, the Union Pacific Railroad needed to hire an outside contractor for railroad improvements. Rather than taking bids, the board members of the Union Pacific Railroad, some of them which worked in the Grant administration, created a sham company called Credit Mobilier. Of course, Union Pacific hired Credit Mobilier to pay for the work, and charged the Union Pacific exorbitant fees, upwards of 400% above what the competition would have charged. This led to huge profits for corporation executives, some of which worked within the Grant administration. The scandal came to a head when Grant's own personal secretary was amongst the board members to get caught. It got stickier when Grant attempted to come to his defense, writing a letter to his friend's jury trying to exonerate him from responsibility. Other members of Grant's cabinet were riddled with scandal. Secretary of War William Belknap was accused of taking bribes from companies trying to provide resources to Native American reservations in a kind of pay-to-play atmosphere. Grant, frustrated by the partisan politics, reluctantly accepted Belknap's resignation, but it gives the illusion that if Grant didn't know about these scandals, he certainly condoned it. The next item that defines the Grant presidency is going to be the Panic of 1873, a recession of significance, because it's going to define the way that politics follows in the next 50 years. So during the Civil Wars, we discussed the Union economy is strong. Expansion of industry and growth, the issuance of loans in order to build the war machine of the country was pretty unregulated. Well, as we get into about the 10th to 15th year following the Civil War, the market has cooled, but production continues to remain high, leading to surplus. Um, Anytime you're dealing with economics and a surplus is created, it oftentimes drives down prices. Businesses then lose money, and oftentimes it can set in panic that has a ripple effect, creating a recession or a depression. That's exactly what happened in 1873. Um, as the market cooled off, businesses continued to spend a tremendous amount of money. Banks continued to issue credit to people that couldn't afford it. And when those people defaulted on their loans, those banks went belly up. When banks start going belly up, the entire economy can be affected. 15,000 businesses went out of business during the Panic of 1873. Hardest hit by this recession were freedmen. Uh, the Freedmen's Bureau had created a savings and trust company to help manage money that was to be spent on African Americans. That money was invested in unsecured loans to companies that were shaky investments. When those companies went belly up, the Freedmen's Bureau lost that savings for Black people. Over $7 million was lost, and the long-term consequence of that particular event was a ingrained distrust by African Americans of financial institutions. Looking at Forbes magazine today, I found an article that discusses how the savings rate difference between white Americans and Black Americans is astronomical. The average white American has somewhere around $150,000 in their savings by the time that they hit 65, while the average African American has saved only $19,000 for their retirement. As far as personal accumulation of wealth and in other kinds of investments, the average investments of a white American is around $500,000. African Americans, it's closer to $90,000. This disparity in putting money into established institutions begins with Reconstruction and the mismanagement of the Freedmen Bureau's savings. Another consequence of the recession is a flare-up of discussion about how currency ought to be backed. As we talked about monetary policy before, the debate over whether or not to issue soft currency and flood the market with new paper money versus making money tied to a hard currency like gold gets brought up again. Grant was considering issuing more paper money at the request of Midwestern and Southerners when the influence of business owners of the Northeast intervened. Grant ends up vetoing a bill that would have ordered the Treasury to print more money and thus avoids inflation. At the same time, in order to stabilize the currency that's already in the market, Grant reduces the number of greenbacks that are in circulation. Remember, greenbacks is a currency that is most popular with Midwestern farmers and former soldiers, veterans of the Civil War. And so when he reduces the amount of circulation, making money scarce makes it difficult for people to do business. On one side of things, it increases the value of money and retains the value of money better. This is a process called deflation. But on the other end, it makes it difficult for people to buy the things that they need to buy. Debtors, farmers, Southerners turn to alternative types of currency, particularly silver. I guess the best example I can come up with today is Bitcoin. If you think about how this digital currency is being used today, the government doesn't condone it, but there's nothing that the government can do to stop people from using it as a form of currency to buy and trade for things online. Silver becomes the Bitcoin of the 19th century. Uh, Ironically, in the Southwest, in places like New Mexico and Arizona, a big silver lode was discovered in those new territories. And so silver companies start issuing tons of silver. People are familiar with using silver as money. The government had used silver at one point, but the government isn't regulating the silver. And so quickly, silver depreciates in value as inflation of silver sets in. In the 1870s, the value of silver was about 1/16th of an ounce. But the more silver that is flooded into the market to Midwestern farmers, the less value it has. Eventually, Congress drops the use of silver temporarily, and farmers suffer from the consequences of inflation. Ultimately, the Grant administration handled the recession fairly well. They retained the value of the greenbacks. The economy shrinks, money maintains and actually increases in value. But for poorer people who are indebted, who need money for their everyday activities, it's a time of reduced access. The reason that we need to identify this is because as we get into the 20th century, populism, this political movement by Midwestern farmers, is going to attack the gold standard. They're going to push for a silver standard or softer currency. And the rise of populism is going to shape the political climate of the 1910s and the 1920s. So President Grant had a mixed administration as far as successes and failures. Corruption, but he navigates the economic issues of the country fairly well. He considers running for a third term, but the Democrats of Congress are quick to pass a anti-dictatorship resolution, and he decides to hang it up. Grant and Lincoln, two very popular, well-known Republicans, set the precedent for the party. But there isn't a Republican with the kind of credentials that Lincoln and Grant had. And so in the election of 1876, the party changes gears and turns towards the little-known Rutherford B. Hayes. The one thing Hayes has going for him is he's from the swing state of Ohio. He served three terms there as governor, and Ohio is kind of the middle of the country as far as the population goes. It's the Midwest of the 19th century. So Republicans are hoping to make inroads in the Midwest where Democrats in the old Northwest had started to establish a foothold. And running against Hayes is Samuel Tilden. We talked about him yesterday. He's the Attorney General who had prosecuted Boss Tweed in the Tammany Hall scandals we discussed. Neither Tilden nor Hayes are very popular or very well known. And so this election is a squeaker. Tilden needs 185 electoral votes to win. He has 184. The chaos of Reconstruction in the South leads to suspicion and to corruption in counting electoral votes in 3 contested states, Louisiana, Florida, and South Carolina. Neither party trusts the other, so both parties count ballots and issue a statement declaring themselves a winner. So they send 2 sets of election results to Congress, and Congress is stuck wondering, what can we do now? The Constitution doesn't actually say who is supposed to count votes. It's a state level decision. And neither party is going to accept the other side's outcome. And so, as a part of compromise, keeping in mind the election or the inauguration date is coming close, Republicans and Democrats agree to pass a law called the Election Count Act of 1877. It creates a commission, a bipartisan commission of Republicans and Democrats and members of the Supreme Court to go through the ballots, count them a second time, and issue the results. So, a month before Inauguration Day, the results come rolling in. And the contested states are supposed to announce their results in alphabetical order. So Florida is the first to issue its outcome. And the outcome of the Florida election is slightly in favor of Rutherford B. Hayes. So Democrats are outraged. They feel like the wool has been pulled over their eyes. If you remember our discussion, the South is a Democratic stronghold. And so Democrats threaten to filibuster. What a filibuster is a legislative tactic in the Senate that stops business from continuing. A senator can get up and start talking and doesn't have to sit down, and business can't move forward until he does. So they threaten to filibuster and bring the Republicans back to the table. Now, it appears that Hayes has legitimately won the election, but if they aren't able to ratify the outcome of the election, there will be no president. So Republicans agree that in exchange for Hayes's presidency, they will be sure to place several Democrats inside of his cabinet. So to give the Democrats some patronage in the Hayes White House. The other thing is that they agree that they will subsidize a railroad from Texas to the Pacific. If you remember, the original Transcontinental Railroad plan was supposed to go through that route, and that was scrapped for the more northern route. Congress will be willing to build that second railroad if Hayes is elected. The final and most important element of the Compromise of 1877 is that Hayes will remove federal troops from the South and officially end Reconstruction. The deal is made, Hayes is elected, and Reconstruction officially ends. Really, the last dying gasp of the civil rights movements of the 19th century is the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1875, 2 years prior. It had, in an effort to address Jim Crow laws that had been mistreating African Americans and denying them access to public accommodations like schools, the Congress had passed a bill that would deny states the ability to eliminate African Americans from public accommodations like schools. This is going to be ineffective because there is no teeth behind it. While it says it's illegal, there are no consequences for violating the law. And eventually the Supreme Court, which has a Southern lean to it, uses its power to rule certain elements of the Civil Rights Act as unconstitutional. Okay? For example, states, the court holds, are allowed to discriminate against African Americans. The Constitution only applies to the national government. Now, today we don't have that same ruling, but at the time, this seemed to make sense. So the courts get involved, and Hayes withdraws the troops from the South, and it's to great relief of Southerners. The era of Reconstruction has ended. There's one more thing I want to mention here in our discussion about the end of Reconstruction and the Supreme Courts. Even though it falls outside of our timeline, we need to be able to identify the court case of Plessy versus Ferguson. Schools are going to be the battlegrounds of segregation. African Americans hungry for education after emancipation um, want to attend public schools. We talked about how Black Congresses in the South had created public schools for the first time. White citizens of Southern states did not want to see integration in their school systems, and so tried to establish Negro school districts separate from white school districts. The 14th Amendment says that a state cannot deny people equal protection under the law. So the constitutional question becomes, can you create separate facilities that are equal? Okay. Is it constitutional to have separate but equal? And under Plessy versus Ferguson, the court is going to rule yes, that separate is equal. That as long as each side has a schoolhouse, has books, has chairs, has teachers, has blackboards, that separate can be equal. That's what we call tangible elements. So as long as tangible elements are equal, the Constitution hasn't been violated. Keep this in mind because down the road, we're going to talk about Brown versus Board of Education when this ruling is overturned. But for the meantime, separate is considered equal. Now, the reality is the quality of tangible elements of education for Black students was not equal. Yeah, there might be a schoolhouse, but it was run down. They might have books, but they would be outdated. They might have teachers, but they weren't qualified. They might have desks and chairs, but they would have been the leftovers and garbage from the local white school. They might have a classroom where a white school district had separate classrooms for different grades. But that's going to be the standard in the Jim Crow South until the 1950s and even into the 1960s. So to sum up, the end of Reconstruction meant the removal of the advancements that had been made following the Civil War. We're going to continue to see terrorist actions by the Ku Klux Klan and white communities against African Americans. A record number of African Americans are lynched in the 1890s. That number won't be touched until we get into the 1960s during the civil rights era of Martin Luther King. And it's going to be more than a century before African Americans are able to vote again in any kind of meaningful way. When you hear the term Jim Crow, that's what we're talking about. Local laws passed to control Black populations, reduce their participation in the public sphere, and to all but eliminate their ability to vote. I'll leave you with this final image. This is Jim Crow justice in 1893. A Black man named Henry Smith was burned at the stake in Paris, Texas, for supposedly molesting a 4-year-old white girl. Hundreds of people turned out to gawk at this spectacle. Public executions like this one were common in the South. More common were the lynchings of Black men aimed at intimidating African Americans into accepting their second-class status in the Jim Crow South.